The desert wind carried dust across the barren landscape as Thomas Morrison stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, watching the sun sink below the distant mountains. He had lived this way for 7 years now, alone with his cattle, his thoughts, and the endless expanse of New Mexico territory. The solitude had become his companion, perhaps even his preference, after the losses that had driven him here in the first place. Thomas had come west after the war, not the recent conflicts with the Apache, but the great civil war that had torn the nation apart. He'd lost his wife to fever during those terrible years, and his 2 sons had never returned from the battlefields of Virginia. The ranch had been his escape, a place where he could work until exhaustion claimed him each night, where the silence meant he didn't have to explain his grief to anyone or pretend to move forward when his heart remained anchored in the past. The ranch itself was modest, a few hundred acres of rough grazing land with a reliable spring that made it valuable in this harsh country. He ran perhaps 100 head of cattle, enough to make a living but not so many that he couldn't manage them alone. His neighbors were few and far between, and that was exactly how he preferred it. When he did venture into the small settlement of Socorro for supplies, he kept his conversations brief and his business efficient. But everything changed on a cold morning in late autumn when he discovered them huddled near his spring. 5 Apache women, their dark eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and defiance. They were wrapped in torn blankets, their faces gaunt with hunger, and from what he could see, they had been traveling for days, perhaps weeks. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, the natural reaction of any rancher in Apache country, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the oldest woman stepped forward, placing herself between him and the others. Or perhaps it was the recognition that these weren't warriors but refugees, survivors of something terrible. Thomas had seen enough death and displacement in his lifetime to recognize desperation when it stood before him. Through gestures and the few Spanish words they shared, he learned their story in fragments over the following days. They were widows, their husbands killed in the recent cavalry raids on their village. The attacks had been brutal, indiscriminate, part of the Army's campaign to force all Apache onto reservations. These women had fled into the mountains with nothing, watching their world burn behind them. They had been wandering, starving, trying to stay ahead of the soldiers who would have forced them onto the reservation at San Carlos, a place they spoke of with genuine terror. Thomas knew the stories about San Carlos. Everyone did. It was a death trap, overcrowded and diseased, where proud nomadic people were confined on barren land that couldn't support them. The corruption was legendary, with Indian agents selling food supplies meant for the Apache while people starved. He understood why they would risk everything to avoid that fate. He should have turned them in. Any reasonable man would have. Harboring Apache refugees could cost him everything, his ranch, possibly his life if the wrong people found out. The territory was aflame with hatred after years of raids and counter-raids, atrocities committed by both sides. There was no middle ground, no room for compassion in this conflict. Yet Thomas found himself unable to do it. Perhaps it was because he saw in their eyes the same loss he carried in his own heart. Perhaps it was simply that he was tired of death and destruction. Whatever the reason, he made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. He would let them stay, at least for a while, until they regained their strength and could decide what to do next. The arrangement began awkwardly, with mutual suspicion and uncertainty. He gave them the old bunkhouse, a structure he had never used and had planned to tear down. It was rough but solid, with a stove and enough space for them all. He brought them food from his supplies, trying not to think about how quickly his stores were depleting. They accepted his help with dignity, never begging, always maintaining their composure even in their desperate circumstances. The oldest of the women, whom he learned was called Nalin, became their spokeswoman. She was perhaps 50, her face weathered by sun and hardship but her bearing proud. Despite everything she had endured, she carried herself with a quiet authority that commanded respect. The others ranged in age from a young woman barely 20 to another in her late 30s. Each had lost everything, husbands, children, homes, their entire way of life swept away in the violence that had consumed their people. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. The women began to work, quietly contributing to the ranch without being asked. Thomas would discover water carried from the spring, firewood stacked near his door, repairs made to fences he hadn't gotten around to fixing. Nolan had knowledge of desert plants he had never noticed, showing him roots and herbs that could be eaten or used for medicine. They tanned hides from the cattle he slaughtered, wasting nothing, creating useful items from materials he would have discarded. Communication remained difficult, but they developed a shared vocabulary of essential words and phrases, mixing English, Spanish, and Apache. Through these halting conversations, Thomas learned more about their lives before the destruction. They had been part of a small band that had tried to avoid conflict, moving seasonally through the mountains, hunting and gathering as their people had done for generations. They spoke of their husbands with pride, men who had been providers and protectors, killed while trying to defend their families from an attack that had come at dawn without warning. Thomas found himself looking forward to the sounds of activity around the ranch, the evidence that he was no longer alone. He had grown so accustomed to silence that he had forgotten what it was like to share space with others, to be part of a community, however small and unusual. The women seemed to sense his loneliness, and while they maintained a respectful distance, they created a presence that was comforting rather than intrusive. Winter arrived with particular harshness that year, and Thomas was grateful for the preparations they had made together. The woodpile was higher than it had ever been, and the women had helped him bring the cattle closer to the ranch where they could be monitored during storms. When snow blocked the trails and isolated them completely, they settled into a routine that felt almost natural. It was during those long winter evenings that the walls between them truly began to crumble. Gathered around the fire in the main house, which Thomas now opened to them during the coldest nights, they shared stories. The women taught him about their traditions, their beliefs about the land and the spirits that inhabited it. He told them about his own losses, finding words for grief he had never spoken aloud. There was healing in these exchanges, a recognition that suffering was universal and that survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected sources. The youngest woman, Casa, had a gift for laughter that seemed miraculous given all she had endured. She would find humor in small things, her eyes lighting up with mischief that reminded Thomas painfully of his own sons at that age. Another, Desba, was skilled with leather and began teaching Thomas techniques for saddle repair that far exceeded his clumsy efforts. Each woman brought her own strengths, her own personality, slowly revealing themselves as they felt safer. But Thomas knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. Spring would bring travelers on the trails again, and with them the danger of discovery. He worried constantly about what would happen if soldiers came by, if neighboring ranchers stopped in, if anyone learned what he was sheltering. The women worried too. He could see it in the way they startled at unexpected sounds, how they always knew where the horses were in case they needed to flee quickly. The decision about what to do long-term weighed heavily on all of them. The women couldn't stay hidden forever, and they couldn't return to their old way of life. It no longer existed. The reservations remained their only official option, but that felt like choosing a slow death over a quick one. Thomas lay awake many nights, wrestling with the impossibility of their situation. When spring finally arrived, it brought with it both hope and fear. The ranch had survived the winter better than any year since Thomas had been alone. The cattle were healthy, the buildings were in better repair, and the land itself seemed more productive under their collective care. But it also brought the reality that they couldn't continue hiding indefinitely. It was Nolan who finally spoke what they were all thinking. Through their shared language, she expressed that they wanted to stay, to continue building this unexpected community they had created. She understood the risks to Thomas, the danger he faced by protecting them, but she also believed that sometimes doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing. Thomas realized that these 5 women had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to care about tomorrow, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. They had created something together that was worth fighting for, a small refuge of humanity in a world that seemed determined to choose hatred and violence. Whatever came next, whatever risks they would face, he knew he couldn't abandon them now. They had found each other in the wilderness, 5 widows and 1 lonely man, and together they had built something that felt remarkably like home.